You wake up at 2 a.m. with a burning feeling climbing up the middle of your chest, sometimes reaching all the way to the back of your throat, and you already know the routine before your eyes are even fully open. Sit up. Reach for the water on the nightstand. Maybe chew one of the chalky tablets you started keeping in the drawer a few years ago, the ones you never used to need. You tell yourself it was the pasta sauce, or the glass of wine, or eating too close to bedtime, and you go back to sleep propped up on an extra pillow like that's just a normal part of getting older now. I'm not going to tell you to cut out spicy food or stop drinking coffee, because if you're anything like most people watching this, you've already tried that, and it barely moved the needle. The real problem isn't sitting on your plate. It's sitting a few inches below your throat, in a piece of anatomy you have never once thought about, a one-way valve that used to close properly every single time and, sometime after you turned 50, quietly started letting things through that it was never supposed to let through. Before I tell you exactly what that valve is and how you get it working properly again, I want to prove something to you first, because if I just said your reflux isn't really about the food, you'd have every right not to believe me. So let me show you the actual anatomy and the actual numbers, because once you see them, the rest of this video is going to make complete sense, and you're never going to look at a bag of antacids the same way again. Somewhere between your esophagus and your stomach sits a ring of muscle called the lower esophageal sphincter. Most people have never heard the term, and almost nobody has ever had it explained to them in plain language, so here's the short version. It's a one-way door. When you swallow, it opens just long enough to let food and liquid drop down into your stomach, then it's supposed to clamp shut again, sealing the stomach off from the esophagus above it. That seal is the only thing standing between the acidic, corrosive contents of your stomach and the much more delicate tissue lining your esophagus, which was never built to handle stomach acid touching it regularly. In a properly functioning digestive system, that valve holds its seal reliably, hundreds of times a day, without you ever noticing it's there. Researchers who study aging and digestion have measured something quietly alarming about this valve over the last few decades. The resting pressure that seals it shut, the actual clamping force keeping stomach acid where it belongs, measurably declines with age. Studies using pressure-sensing catheters passed down into the esophagus have found that average lower esophageal sphincter pressure in adults past 50 runs meaningfully lower than in adults in their 20s and 30s, and the decline tends to accelerate through the following decades. Alongside that pressure drop, the prevalence of a related structural change called a hiatal hernia, where part of the upper stomach slides up through the diaphragm and physically displaces that valve out of its ideal working position, climbs sharply with age. Some imaging studies estimate that by the time people reach their 60s, a meaningful hiatal hernia is present in somewhere around half of the population, most of them with no idea it's there, because it doesn't show up as a distinct symptom on its own. It shows up as reflux that quietly gets worse year after year, and gets blamed on dinner. Now hold that number next to this one. Population surveys tracking gastroesophageal reflux disease, the medical term for chronic, symptomatic acid reflux, consistently find that both the prevalence and the severity of symptoms rise steadily with age, with a noticeable inflection point right around the 5th and 6th decades of life. It isn't a smooth, gradual curve that started in your 20s and has just been quietly climbing the whole time. For a large share of people, it's closer to a valve that held its seal reasonably well for decades and then started losing its grip at almost exactly the same point in life. Researchers keep measuring the pressure decline and the hiatal hernia prevalence taking off. Those two facts sitting next to each other should feel strange in the same way it felt strange to hear that 90-year-olds in a nursing home can still build new muscle. It isn't that your digestive system suddenly developed a grudge against tomato sauce in your 50s. It's that one specific, measurable, mechanical valve lost a meaningful share of its clamping force right around the same age you started reaching for antacids more often, and almost nobody ever explained the connection to you plainly. Here's the reframe I need you to sit with, because it's the entire foundation of everything else in this video. It's not that your stomach suddenly became more sensitive to spicy food or caffeine after 50. It's that the valve responsible for keeping stomach contents where they belong lost enough resting tension that foods and drinks which used to get held back without any trouble at all now find an opening they didn't have before. The trigger foods aren't wrong, exactly. Coffee, alcohol, mint, chocolate, and fatty meals genuinely do relax that valve further on top of whatever baseline weakness is already there. But treating the food list as the whole problem is like blaming a leaky faucet entirely on how hard you turned the handle, while ignoring that the washer inside has worn down and would leak eventually no matter how gently you turned it. The valve is the washer. The diet advice you've already tried is the handle. You can turn it as gently as you want and still get drips if the seal underneath has worn thin. Let's actually walk through the mechanics of why this valve exists, how it's supposed to work, and exactly what changes inside it and around it as the decades go by, because once you see this clearly, you're going to understand your own nighttime symptoms in a completely different way. The lower esophageal sphincter isn't just a single ring of muscle working in isolation. It's reinforced from the outside by a band of your diaphragm called the crura, which wraps around the esophagus right where it passes through your chest cavity into your abdomen, adding an extra layer of external pinch to the valve's own internal squeeze. Think of it as a door with both an internal lock and a security bar braced across the outside. The internal muscle ring provides the baseline seal. The diaphragm's crural sling adds reinforcement, particularly important during moments of increased pressure in your abdomen, like bending over, lying down, or simply having a full stomach after a meal. There's also a natural anatomical angle where the esophagus meets the stomach, called the angle of His, which is sharp enough in a healthy digestive system to act almost like a flap valve, using the stomach's own shape and the pressure of its contents to help press the opening closed from below. All three of those systems, the internal muscle tone, the external diaphragmatic reinforcement, and the angle of His, work together as a genuinely elegant piece of engineering for most of your life. And all three of them are vulnerable to the exact same slow deterioration that shows up almost everywhere else in an aging body: connective tissue gradually losing some of its elasticity, muscle tissue gradually losing some of its resting tone, and structural support gradually loosening under decades of repeated pressure. When a hiatal hernia develops, part of the stomach slides upward through the diaphragmatic opening, and it takes the valve with it, physically pulling it out of the zone where the crural sling can reinforce it properly and flattening out the angle of His at the same time. You end up with a door that's lost its internal lock's grip, lost its external security bar support, and been physically dragged slightly out of its frame, all at once, all from the same underlying process. This isn't random misfortune, and it isn't an inevitable tax simply for having a birthday. There are a small number of very specific, very ordinary reasons this valve weakens over the decades, and once you see them laid out, you'll likely recognize your own life in more than one. The first is decades of intra-abdominal pressure. Every time you strain during a bowel movement, hold your breath while lifting something heavy, or carry extra weight around your midsection, you're generating pressure inside your abdominal cavity that pushes upward against your diaphragm and the stomach beneath it. A single instance of that pressure is nothing. Repeated for decades, it's one of the primary mechanical forces believed to gradually widen the diaphragmatic opening the esophagus passes through, setting the stage for a hiatal hernia to develop. This is part of why increased waist circumference is one of the most consistently identified risk factors for worsening reflux in the research literature, not because fat itself irritates the esophagus, but because it raises the ambient pressure pushing upward against that valve every single day, all day, for years. The second is a decline in smooth muscle tone that runs in parallel with the same broad connective tissue aging seen throughout the body. The lower esophageal sphincter is made of smooth muscle, the same category of involuntary muscle tissue found in blood vessels and other internal organs, and smooth muscle tissue throughout the body shows measurable declines in resting tone and responsiveness with age, driven by changes in the signaling systems that keep it appropriately contracted. It's a related but distinct process from the loss of skeletal muscle mass you'd notice in your arms and legs, but it follows a similarly quiet, cumulative pattern, tone gradually easing off over years without any single dramatic moment marking the change. The third is a decline in saliva production and swallow frequency, which sounds unrelated until you understand what saliva actually does for this system. Saliva is mildly alkaline, and every time you swallow, even without eating anything, a small amount of that alkaline saliva washes down and helps neutralize and clear any acid that has crept up past the valve. Saliva production measurably decreases with age, and swallow frequency naturally drops during sleep, which is exactly why reflux symptoms so often concentrate at night. You're not just dealing with a weaker valve after dark. You're dealing with a weaker valve at the exact hours your body's built-in neutralizing and clearing system is least active, while you're also lying flat, removing the assistance gravity normally provides in keeping stomach contents down where they belong. Stack those three things together: decades of accumulated abdominal pressure gradually widening the diaphragmatic opening, a natural decline in smooth muscle tone loosening the valve's own grip, and reduced overnight saliva production removing your best acid-clearing defense right when the valve needs it most, and you get exactly the pattern researchers keep finding. A valve that held its seal reliably for decades and then began losing ground right around the age most people start calling reflux a normal part of getting older, rather than recognizing it as a specific, mechanical, and substantially correctable shift. I want to be honest about the actual chain of consequences here, because the stakes go well beyond an uncomfortable night's sleep, and I think it's worth taking seriously rather than filing this under minor inconvenience. Chronic, repeated exposure of the esophagus to stomach acid is directly linked to a progression of tissue damage that researchers have mapped out clearly over decades of study. Persistent reflux irritates and inflames the esophageal lining, a condition called esophagitis, and in a meaningful subset of long-term sufferers, the tissue at the bottom of the esophagus responds to that repeated acid exposure by changing its own cellular structure into something that more closely resembles the acid-resistant lining of the stomach, a condition called Barrett's esophagus. Barrett's esophagus matters because it's the single strongest known risk factor for esophageal adenocarcinoma, a serious cancer that has become significantly more common over the last several decades, tracking closely alongside the broader rise in chronic reflux in aging populations. There's also a genuinely underappreciated overnight risk specific to older adults. When reflux happens while you're lying flat and asleep, stomach contents don't always stay contained in the esophagus. In some cases, small amounts can be aspirated, meaning they're inhaled into the airway rather than staying in the digestive tract, particularly in older adults where the reflexes that normally protect the airway during sleep have also weakened somewhat with age, the same broad pattern of declining muscular reflex speed. Aspiration of stomach contents is a recognized contributing factor in a portion of pneumonia cases in older adults, and it's one of the quieter, less discussed reasons nighttime reflux deserves to be taken more seriously than an inconvenient burning feeling that antacids can paper over. And there's a third consequence worth naming honestly, because it involves the very tool most people reach for first. Long-term daily use of proton pump inhibitors, the strong acid-suppressing medications frequently prescribed for chronic reflux, has been associated in a number of studies with reduced absorption of certain nutrients that depend on stomach acid for proper uptake, including vitamin B12, magnesium, and calcium, with some research pointing toward a modestly elevated fracture risk with very long-term use. None of this means the medication is wrong to use, and stopping a prescribed medication without talking to your doctor first is not what this video is suggesting. It means the medication is treating the downstream symptom, acid production, while the upstream mechanical problem, a valve that isn't sealing properly, continues quietly unaddressed underneath it, which is exactly the gap this video is aimed at closing. Here's where I need to be direct with you, the same way I was direct earlier. This valve doesn't respond to a single trick or a 2-day fix. But unlike a fully mechanical hernia that requires surgical repair, in the large majority of people, the tone, positioning, and clearance systems around this valve respond meaningfully to a specific, consistent set of changes, done correctly, for weeks rather than days. The single most effective change, and the one almost nobody actually does correctly, is elevating the head of your bed itself, not stacking extra pillows under your head and neck, which mostly just bends your neck forward without changing the angle of your torso relative to gravity. Actually raising the entire head of the bed frame by 6 to 8 inches, using bed risers or a wedge that lifts your upper body from the waist up, uses gravity to help keep stomach contents down where they belong for the several hours after your last meal when your valve is under the most pressure and your saliva-based clearance system is least active. This single change is one of the most consistently supported interventions in the actual clinical research on nighttime reflux, and it's also one of the most commonly done incorrectly, because a stack of pillows under your head alone doesn't accomplish the same thing. Sleep position matters here too, in a specific and slightly counterintuitive way. Lying on your left side, rather than your right side or your back, takes advantage of the actual anatomical position of your stomach relative to your esophagus. Because of how the stomach sits in your abdomen, sleeping on your left side keeps the junction between your esophagus and stomach positioned above the pool of stomach contents, while sleeping on your right side tends to do the opposite, placing that junction lower and making it easier for acid to reach it. Multiple studies measuring reflux episodes across sleep positions have found meaningfully less nighttime acid exposure in left-side sleepers compared to right-side sleepers, a difference driven purely by anatomy rather than anything you have to actively do once you're asleep. Timing your last meal matters more than what's actually in it, in most cases. Finishing eating at least 3 hours before lying down gives your stomach meaningful time to empty a significant portion of its contents before gravity stops working in your favor, directly reducing how much volume is sitting there available to reflux upward once you lie flat. This single timing change often produces a noticeably bigger improvement than an entire list of eliminated trigger foods, because it addresses the volume and pressure sitting behind the valve rather than just one or two things that mildly relax it. And there's a piece almost nobody mentions that directly targets that external diaphragmatic reinforcement we talked about earlier. Diaphragmatic breathing exercises, slow, deep breaths that deliberately expand the belly rather than the chest, done consistently for several minutes a day, have shown in a number of studies to meaningfully improve reflux symptoms, and the proposed mechanism is exactly the crural sling we discussed, the band of diaphragm tissue that wraps around and reinforces the valve from the outside. Training that muscle deliberately, the same way you'd train any other muscle that's lost some of its resting tone, appears to genuinely strengthen the external support system holding that valve closed, on top of whatever's happening with the internal muscle ring itself. If waist circumference has crept upward over the years, addressing that directly reduces the baseline intra-abdominal pressure pushing up against the entire system every single day, which is one of the more reliably supported interventions in the research for anyone carrying meaningful extra weight around the midsection, independent of any specific diet approach used to get there. You've probably heard the confident claim that reflux is simply caused by too much stomach acid, and that the entire solution is suppressing acid production as aggressively and as long as necessary. For a genuine minority of cases, particularly conditions involving actual acid overproduction, that framing holds up reasonably well. But for the majority of adults developing new or worsening reflux after 50, the research points to something different. Most people with age-related reflux don't actually produce more stomach acid than they did at 30. In many cases, acid production modestly declines with age, right alongside everything else. What's changed isn't how much acid is being made. It's how effectively the valve is keeping a completely normal, unremarkable amount of acid where it belongs. Suppressing acid production can absolutely reduce symptoms, because there's simply less acid available to cause damage when it does get through, but it's addressing the wrong side of the equation for a large share of people, silencing the smoke alarm rather than checking why smoke keeps entering the room in the first place. I don't want to oversell this, because doing so would undercut everything true I've said so far. Positional changes, timing your meals, sleeping on your left side, and diaphragmatic breathing genuinely address real mechanical contributors to this problem for a large share of people. They are not a guaranteed fix for everyone, and a significant hiatal hernia, once it's large enough, sometimes does require surgical evaluation rather than lifestyle changes alone. If you're experiencing difficulty swallowing, unintentional weight loss, vomiting blood, or black stools alongside reflux symptoms, that's not something to address with sleep position. That's something to bring to a doctor promptly. And if you're currently on a proton pump inhibitor, this video is not telling you to stop it. It's telling you there's an entire upstream mechanism worth addressing alongside whatever your doctor has you on, one that virtually nobody explains clearly, and one that gives you genuine agency over a problem that usually gets handed to you as simply the cost of getting older. Think about that 2 a.m. moment we started with, reaching for the water and the tablets you keep in the drawer now. That routine isn't actually about the pasta sauce from dinner, and it was never really about your personal sensitivity to spicy food creeping up with age. It's a specific, physical, measurable valve that held its seal reliably for 50-some years and has been quietly losing its grip through a combination of pressure, tone, and positioning, all of which happen to be things you can actually influence starting tonight. Picture what's actually on the other side of getting this right. It isn't just fewer chalky tablets in the nightstand drawer. It's sleeping through the night without waking up gasping or reaching for water. It's protecting esophageal tissue from years of quiet, repeated acid damage before it has the chance to progress into something far more serious than heartburn. It's keeping the valve doing the one specific job it was built for your entire life, instead of accepting a slowly worsening version of the same symptom as simply the price of turning 50. The valve was never permanently broken. It just lost some tone, some positioning, and some outside reinforcement, the same way almost everything else in an aging body quietly does, and almost nobody ever explained which specific, correctable pieces were actually behind it. Now you know exactly what's happening underneath that burning feeling, and exactly what to do about it.